The year was 1965, and the world was changing in ways that the men in the front row of the Sands Hotel didn't yet care to understand. Outside the air-conditioned bubble of Las Vegas, the Vietnam War was escalating, the Beatles were rewriting the rules of music, and the old guard of Hollywood was beginning to feel the first tremors of a cultural earthquake. But inside the Copa room, time stood still. It was a place of red velvet, shimmering gold leaf, and the heavy, intoxicating scent of high-end tobacco and expensive gin. It was the kingdom of the Rat Pack, and on June 18, the king of that kingdom, Dean Martin, was about to face a crisis that wouldn't be solved with a joke or a song. To the casual observer, Dean was the picture of ease, a man who moved as if he were underwater, fluid and unhurried. But as he stepped into the spotlight that night, he knew that the man sitting at table 4, Vincent Antonelli, hadn't come for the music. He had come to see if Dean Martin was as untouchable as the legends claimed, or if he was just another singer who could be broken like a cheap ceramic plate. Most people looked at Dean Martin and saw the effortless charm of a movie star, but if you looked closer, you could see the calluses on his soul. He was born Dino Crocetti in a town where the smoke from the steel mills choked the sky and the local economy was built on illegal gambling and backroom deals. His father was a barber, and the barbershop was more than a place for a haircut, it was a front, a sanctuary for men who lived outside the law. Young Dino had watched them from the corner of his eye, the men in the expensive coats who never seemed to work but always had money, the men who spoke in low tones and decided the fate of the town over a hand of cards. He learned their language before he learned English. He learned that respect wasn't something you asked for, it was something you took by showing no fear. He had been a bootlegger's delivery boy, a blackjack dealer, and a prizefighter known as Kid Crochet. He had his nose broken and his spirit tested in the blood-slicked rings of the Midwest. By the time he reached Las Vegas, he wasn't just a singer, he was a survivor who knew that in the presence of predators, the only thing that kept you alive was the absolute refusal to blink. The Sands wasn't just a hotel, it was the epicenter of the American entertainment universe, and it was operated with the cold efficiency of a crime family. The men who funded the casinos, men like Sam Giancana and Meyer Lansky, viewed the entertainers as assets, golden geese that laid eggs of tourism and legitimacy. Frank Sinatra understood this and played the game with a diplomat's finesse, walking the tightrope between the stage and the shadows. But Dean was different. He didn't want to be a diplomat. He didn't want to be a partner. He just wanted to be Dean Martin. His split from Jerry Lewis in 1956 had been his declaration of independence, a messy, public divorce that left him with a burning need to prove that he could stand on his own 2 feet without anyone holding him up. When the mob started making demands, when they started treating him like an employee rather than an icon, it touched a nerve that went back to his days in the steel mills. He had spent his whole life breaking free from the control of others, and he wasn't about to let a Las Vegas capo put a leash on him now. Dean was in his dressing room, the air thick with the smell of the witch hazel he used after shaving. He was listening to a demo tape of a new song, his eyes closed, mentally mapping out the phrasing. His assistant, Jackie Romano, entered the room with a trembling hand, followed by a messenger from Vincent Antonelli. The messenger didn't offer a greeting. He simply stated that Mr. Antonelli wanted a meeting after the show to discuss a personal matter involving a dancer at the Tropicana. The girl, a beautiful young woman named Maria, had apparently caught Antonelli's eye, but she had been spending too much time talking about Hollywood and Dean Martin's influence. It was a classic mob setup, a manufactured grievance used to exert control. Dean didn't even open his eyes. He told the messenger that he was busy. He told him that if Antonelli wanted to talk, he could buy a ticket like everyone else. It was a rejection that felt like a slap across the face of the entire Nevada underworld. Jackie Romano, who had grown up in the shadow of the Chicago outfit, felt the temperature in the room drop 20 degrees. He knew that you didn't say no to Antonelli. You negotiated, you stalled, you lied, but you never, ever said no. The pit bosses, usually the loudest men in the room, were quiet. The waiters moved with a frantic, nervous energy. Word had leaked out that Antonelli was insulted. To a man in his position, an insult was a lethal threat. If he allowed a singer to disrespect him, his authority over the rank and file would begin to crumble. The second messenger arrived with a shorter fuse and a longer shadow. He told Dean that the request was now an order. Dean was sitting at his vanity mirror, adjusting the silk pocket square that sat perfectly in his tuxedo jacket. He looked at the messenger through the reflection and smiled that lazy, half-lidded smile that drove audiences wild. He told the man that his ears were fine, but his schedule was full. "I sing for the people who pay," Dean said, his voice a low rumble. "And I don't recall seeing Mr. Antonelli's name on the payroll." When the messenger left, the silence in the dressing room was absolute. Even the hum of the air conditioning seemed to fade away. Dean picked up a glass of scotch, took a slow sip, and looked at Jackie. "You know, Jackie," he said, "the problem with these guys is they think they're the stars of the show. But they're just the guys who own the theater. And without the act, the theater is just an empty room." The atmosphere inside the Sands was electric, a static charge that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up. The high rollers were there, the politicians were there, and the tourists who had saved for a year to see the King of Cool were there. But the first 3 rows were a dead zone. Antonelli had bought them all. 20 men in dark suits, sitting with the rigid posture of soldiers, creating a barrier of silence between Dean and the rest of the audience. It was a psychological ambush designed to rattle him, to make him forget his lyrics, to make him sweat under the lights. Backstage, the tension was so thick it was nauseating. The band members were checking their instruments for the 10th time. The stage manager was checking his watch every 30 seconds. Frank Sinatra had called twice, his voice tight with an anxiety he rarely showed. He told Dean to stay in his room, to cancel the show, to let the lawyers handle it. But Dean just laughed. He put on his coat, checked his reflection one last time, and walked toward the stage. He wasn't walking like a man going to a fight, he was walking like a man going to a party he was sure he was going to enjoy. But as Dean stepped out, the roar hit the wall of the first 3 rows and died. He stood there, the light reflecting off the chrome of the microphone stand, and looked directly into the cold, dead eyes of Vincent Antonelli. The mobster was leaning back, his arms crossed over his chest, his face a mask of predatory boredom. For a long moment, Dean didn't say a word. He just stood there, swaying slightly to a rhythm only he could hear, soaking in the silence. Then, he leaned into the microphone and whispered, "I see the funeral directors are in town." A few brave souls in the back laughed. The men in the front didn't move. It was the opening move in a chess game played with lives on the line. Dean signaled the band, and the first notes of "Ain't That a Kick in the Head" filled the room. He sang with a ferocity he usually hid behind his casual mask. Every note was perfect, every gesture was polished, but there was an edge to it, a defiance that the 45 to 60-year-olds in the audience, the ones who had lived through the war and the hard years of the 50s, could sense in their bones. This wasn't just entertainment. This was a man standing his ground. Dean was halfway through a medley of his hits, the sweat just beginning to bead on his forehead under the heat of the lamps. He was telling a story about Jerry Lewis, a self-deprecating bit that usually got a huge laugh, when he saw Antonelli reach into his jacket. The movement was slow, deliberate, and unmistakable. The entire room seemed to shrink. People in the 4th and 5th rows began to lean away, their faces pale with the sudden realization that they might be caught in a crossfire. Antonelli didn't pull out a gun, not yet. He pulled out a heavy gold lighter and a cigar. He lit it, blew a thick cloud of smoke directly toward the stage, and then, with his other hand, made a slow, horizontal motion across his throat. The cutthroat sign. It was the ultimate ultimatum. In the parlance of the streets Dean had grown up in, it meant, you are dead. You just haven't stopped breathing yet. The band faltered. The drummer missed a beat. The trumpet player's note turned into a sour squeal. The music died out, leaving only the sound of the air conditioning and the pounding of 2,800 hearts. Dean Martin stopped. He stood in the center of the stage, the smoke from Antonelli's cigar drifting toward him like a ghostly hand. He didn't look at the band. He didn't look at the exit. He didn't look at the security guards who were frozen in the wings. He looked at the microphone in his hand, then he looked at Antonelli. A slow, dangerous smile crept across his lips, the kind of smile a gambler makes when he knows he's holding the winning card and the other guy is bluffing. "You know, Vincent," Dean said, his voice amplified by the massive speakers until it felt like the walls themselves were speaking, "my father always said that if you're going to threaten a man, you should at least have the decency to do it in a tuxedo that fits." The audacity of the comment was like a physical blow. Antonelli's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening until the muscles stood out like cables. Dean began to walk. He didn't walk away, he walked toward the edge of the stage. He knelt down, his knees cracking in the silence, until he was eye to eye with the most feared enforcer in the state of Nevada. "You've been making faces at me all night. You've been trying to ruin the show for these nice people who paid good money to forget their troubles for an hour. Now, if you've got something to say, if you think you can do this better than me, then come on up. Take the mic, sing, Volare, for us. I'm sure your voice is as pretty as your face." He extended the microphone toward Antonelli's hand. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated madness. He was offering the mobster the chance to either kill him in front of 3,000 witnesses or to be humiliated by the sheer weight of Dean's coolness. The silence stretched. Seconds felt like hours. Antonelli's hand hovered near his jacket, his fingers twitching. Every person in that room expected the flash of a muzzle, the sound of a shot, the end of an era. But as they looked at Dean Martin, kneeling there, relaxed, almost bored, as if he were waiting for a bus, something shifted. Antonelli looked at Dean and saw a man who wasn't afraid to die. And in the twisted logic of the underworld, a man who isn't afraid to die is a man you can't control. If he killed Dean Martin there, he would be the man who murdered a legend in cold blood, he would be hunted by the feds, hated by the public, and eventually disposed of by his own bosses for bringing too much heat to the city. But if he laughed, he would be a man who shared a joke with a king. The silence was broken by a sound that no one expected, the low, raspy chuckle of Vincent Antonelli. He shook his head, looking down at the floor, then back at Dean. "You're a crazy bastard, Dino," he said, using Dean's birth name. "You really are." Dean didn't miss a beat. "I've been called worse by better men, Vincent. Now, are you going to sing, or am I going to have to finish this set?" Antonelli waved his hand in a dismissive gesture. "Keep singing, kid. You're all right." Dean Martin sang for another hour, his voice growing richer and more confident with every song. The men in the first 3 rows began to clap. By the end of the night, they were standing. When Dean finally walked off stage after 3 encores, his tuxedo soaked with sweat and his heart racing, he found Jackie Romano waiting for him with a towel and a bottle of scotch. Dean didn't say a word. He just took the bottle, took a long pull, and sat down in his chair. The adrenaline was finally leaving his system, leaving him hollow and exhausted. He had won, but he knew that the win was temporary. In the world he lived in, you had to win every single night. The moment you stopped being the king of cool, you were just another guy from Steubenville waiting for the light to turn red. The story of the microphone standoff became part of the DNA of Las Vegas. It changed the way the mob handled the entertainers. They realized that the Rat Pack wasn't just a group of singers, they were a cultural force that couldn't be bullied into submission. Frank Sinatra, when he finally saw Dean the next morning, didn't yell or lecture. He just hugged him and said, "You're the only man I know who could turn a hit contract into a standing ovation." Dean just shrugged and asked where they were having lunch. He never talked about the fear he felt when he was kneeling on that stage. He never talked about the way his hands shook for 3 hours after the show. He kept it all inside, locked away in the same dark place where he kept the memories of the steel mills and the broken noses of his youth. In the 1970s and 80s, as the glitter of the old Vegas began to fade and the corporations took over the casinos, the era of the mob enforcer became a relic of the past. Vincent Antonelli would eventually meet his end in a dimly lit parking lot, a victim of the very violence he had lived by. But Dean Martin remained. Even as he grew older, even as the losses began to pile up, the death of his son Dean Paul in 1987 being the final, crushing blow, he never lost that core of steel. People wondered why he became so reclusive in his final years, why he spent his days eating pasta and watching westerns in his mansion. They thought he was lonely, or bored, or fading away. But the truth was that Dean Martin had already seen everything the world had to offer. He had faced down the devil at the sands and walked away with a smile. He didn't need the applause anymore. He didn't need the validation. He had proven his point in 1965, and the rest of his life was just the long, cool walk to the exit. It's about the night he refused to be a servant. It's about the microphone he handed to a monster, a gesture that said, "I am the master of this room, and you are just a guest in it." For the generation that grew up watching him, the men and women now in their 50s and 60s, Dean Martin represents a vanished ideal of masculinity. A man who didn't complain, who didn't explain, and who never let the bastards see him sweat. He was the man who could stare death in the face and ask it if it knew the lyrics to "Memories Are Made of This." And that, more than any gold record or Hollywood star, is why we still remember him. That is why, when we hear that velvet voice coming through the speakers, we feel a little bit cooler, a little bit braver, and a little bit more like we can handle whatever Vincent Antonelli is sitting in our own front row.